On the 4th of June 1942, during World War II, the Central Pacific Ocean became a graveyard for the imperial ambitions of Japan as Admiral Chester Nimitz orchestrated a devastating ambush that sent 4 veteran aircraft carriers to the abyss. While the Americans celebrated a miraculous deliverance at the Battle of Midway, Prime Minister Winston Churchill looked toward the horizon with a profound sense of strategic dread that transcended the immediate tactical victory. The smoke rising from the charred remains of the Kido Butai signaled a tectonic shift in the global balance of power that threatened to leave the British Empire as a secondary spectator in its own eastern dominions. Winston Churchill understood with razor-sharp clarity that the defense of the Indian Ocean and the restoration of British prestige required more than just American protection and demanded the physical presence of the white ensign flying from the masts of modern fleet carriers. This was not merely a matter of naval logistics or the deployment of 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft batteries, but a desperate gamble for post-war sovereignty in a world rapidly being reshaped by the industrial might of the United States. As the news of the American victory filtered through the encrypted cables to the underground cabinet war rooms in London, the atmosphere remained thick with the scent of stale cigar smoke and the heavy weight of imperial responsibility. Churchill paced the cramped confines of the map room, his eyes fixed on the vast blue expanse of the Indian Ocean, where the Royal Navy had recently suffered its most humiliating retreats since the Napoleonic era. The loss of the HMS Prince of Wales and the HMS Repulse to Japanese land-based bombers in December 1941 remained an open wound in the British psyche that no amount of American success could easily cauterize. Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, the First Sea Lord, stood in the shadows observing his Prime Minister with a mixture of exhaustion and professional caution, because he knew that every ship sent to the Far East was a ship taken from the life-or-death struggle of the Atlantic convoys. The strategic vacuum created by the temporary neutralization of the Japanese fleet at Midway presented a fleeting window of opportunity that Churchill was determined to exploit before the United States Navy claimed the Pacific as a private American lake. He recognized that if the British did not return to the theater with a credible offensive force, then the liberation of Singapore and the Dutch East Indies would be viewed through the lens of American benevolence rather than British resilience. The Prime Minister began drafting a series of relentless directives to the Admiralty, demanding the immediate reinforcement of the Eastern Fleet under Admiral Sir James Somerville, who was currently languishing with an assortment of obsolete battleships and overworked cruisers. Across the Atlantic, the American Naval Command viewed British aspirations with a skepticism that bordered on open hostility, as Admiral Ernest King, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, maintained a fierce Pacific-first mentality that prioritized American resources for American objectives. King was a man of abrasive temperament who famously remarked that when they get into trouble, they send for the sons of bitches, and he had no intention of allowing the Royal Navy to piggyback on American logistical chains. This friction between the two great English-speaking powers created a secondary battlefield of diplomacy and backroom maneuvers where Churchill had to exert every ounce of his oratory power to convince President Franklin Roosevelt that a British carrier presence was essential for the global war effort. The technical reality of British naval aviation in 1942 was a story of rugged innovation struggling against the sheer scale of American mass production. The illustrious class carriers like the HMS Victorious and HMS Indomitable featured revolutionary 3-inch armored flight decks designed to withstand 500-pound bombs that would have shattered the wooden decks of their American counterparts. However, these armored hangars severely limited the number of aircraft they could carry, often restricting a British fleet carrier to a mere 36 planes, while an American Essex class could easily operate over 90. Churchill obsessed over these figures because he knew that in the brutal arithmetic of carrier warfare, the quantity of the strike package was often the deciding factor between survival and a watery grave. In the humid ports of Kilindini and Colombo, the sailors of the Eastern Fleet waited for the reinforcements that Churchill promised, with a fervor that bordered on the religious. Admiral James Somerville watched his horizon with a grim intensity, knowing that his current force was woefully inadequate to face even a depleted Japanese Navy if they chose to strike toward the oil fields of the Middle East. The sailors spent their days drilling with the aging Fairey Swordfish biplanes, which were affectionately known as string bags because of their antiquated appearance, despite their legendary success against the Italian fleet at Taranto. The contrast between these fabric-covered relics and the sleek Mitsubishi A6M0s of the Japanese was a visual testament to the precarious position of British power in the East. Churchill's demand for a carrier presence was rooted in the psychological necessity of showing the white ensign to the peoples of India and Southeast Asia, who had witnessed the rapid collapse of European colonial authority. The Prime Minister understood that an empire built on the myth of naval invincibility could not survive if it relied solely on a foreign power to police its waters. He argued passionately in the Defense Committee that the Royal Navy must take an active part in the offensive against the Japanese home islands, even if it meant operating as a subordinate element to the American juggernaut. This was a bitter pill for the Admiralty to swallow, but Churchill's vision was fixed firmly on the peace table, where the borders of the post-war world would be drawn by those who shed blood in the final battles. The logistical nightmare of supporting a modern carrier task force thousands of miles from the industrial centers of the United Kingdom cannot be overstated, as every gallon of aviation fuel and every spare part for the Grumman Martlet fighters had to be transported through submarine-infested waters. Churchill pushed for the development of the fleet train, which was a mobile logistics force of tankers and supply ships that would allow the carriers to remain at sea for months at a time. This was a concept the Americans had mastered through sheer industrial capacity, but for the British it was an agonizing process of repurposing civilian merchantmen and older naval auxiliaries. During the late summer of 1942, as the struggle for Guadalcanal began to consume American resources, Churchill saw his opening to force the issue of British participation. He suggested that the HMS Victorious be loaned to the United States Navy to fill a critical gap in carrier strength after the Americans lost the USS Hornet and saw the USS Enterprise heavily damaged. This gesture was a masterstroke of naval diplomacy, as it placed a British carrier in the heart of the American theater of operations and proved that the Royal Navy was willing to fight under American command to achieve the common goal. The sailors of the Victorious even took to calling their ship the USS Limey, as they integrated into the American task force structures and adopted American signaling procedures. The presence of the HMS Victorious in the Pacific provided the British with invaluable intelligence on the nature of modern high-intensity carrier operations that differed significantly from the hunts for the Bismarck or the convoy battles in the Mediterranean. British aviators learned the art of the multi-carrier strike and the complexities of coordinating hundreds of aircraft in a single engagement, while their American counterparts gained a new respect for the resilience of the British armored decks. This period of cooperation was the crucible in which the future British Pacific Fleet was forged, but it also highlighted the massive gap in carrier-borne radar technology and fighter direction that the British would have to close if they were to survive in the coming year. While the tactical lessons were being learned, Churchill remained focused on the broader strategic implications of the Japanese naval movements in the Bay of Bengal. He feared a junction between the Japanese and the German forces in the Middle East, which would have effectively severed the British Empire in two and ended any hope of a coordinated Allied victory. To prevent this, he insisted that the Eastern Fleet maintain a fleet in being that could threaten Japanese shipping lanes and force the Imperial Japanese Navy to keep significant assets in the Indian Ocean rather than concentrating them all against Nimitz in the Pacific. The political pressure Churchill exerted on his own generals and admirals was often perceived as meddling, but his instincts were driven by a historical perspective that few of his contemporaries shared. He saw the Royal Navy not just as a tool for war, but as the very glue that held the Commonwealth together, and he believed that a failure to act decisively in the wake of Midway would lead to the permanent eclipse of British influence. He frequently clashed with Sir Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, who wanted to focus all available resources on the invasion of Europe and viewed the Far Eastern naval theater as a dangerous distraction from the Germany First strategy. By pointing out that the American public was increasingly focused on the war against Japan, and that a failure to support the American effort in the Pacific could lead to a reduction in the Lend-Lease aid that was keeping the British economy afloat. The Prime Minister's ability to weave together naval strategy and international finance was a testament to his multifaceted leadership style, which often left his military advisors breathless and frustrated. He was playing a game of global chess where the pieces were aircraft carriers and the prize was the survival of an empire. By the end of 1942, the groundwork for a sustained British carrier presence had been laid through sheer political will and the strategic foresight of a man who refused to see his nation relegated to the sidelines of history. The arrival of more illustrious class ships and the conversion of light carriers began to tilt the scales of power in the Indian Ocean back toward the British. This was the beginning of a long and arduous journey that would eventually lead to the massive carrier strikes against the oil refineries of Sumatra and the final assault on Okinawa, where the British Pacific Fleet would prove its worth under the most intense kamikaze attacks of the war. The miracle at Midway had indeed shattered the Japanese Navy, but it had also set in motion a profound transformation of British naval doctrine that would define the final years of the conflict. Winston Churchill's relentless demand for a carrier presence was the catalyst for this change, as he recognized that in the age of the airplane, the battleship was a relic and the carrier was the new sovereign of the seas. As the sun set over the Indian Ocean in December 1942, the flickering lights of the British fleet signaled a renewed defiance and a commitment to fight until the very end, regardless of the cost or the odds. By the dawn of 1943, the strategic tide began to turn with the cold mechanical precision of a clockwork engine as the Royal Navy prepared to transition from a desperate defensive posture to a sophisticated offensive machine. Winston Churchill remained the primary architect of this transformation because he understood that the survival of British influence in the Far East depended on more than just the persistence of the merchant marine and the endurance of the infantrymen. The Prime Minister spent his nights reviewing the technical specifications of the new implacable class carriers, which represented the pinnacle of British naval engineering with their double-story hangars and enhanced radar suites. He knew that the victory at Midway had merely bought the Allies time, and that the true test of British naval power would come when they had to operate in the vast logistical deserts of the Central Pacific, where every drop of fuel was worth its weight in blood. Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser emerged as the pivotal commander who would translate Churchill's grand vision into operational reality as he took command of the British Pacific Fleet, with a mandate to integrate seamlessly into the American naval hierarchy. Fraser was a man of immense technical competence and diplomatic tact, who understood that the Americans led by the formidable Admiral Ernest King were still wary of British intentions. He worked tirelessly to establish a rapport with Admiral Chester Nimitz, ensuring that the British contribution would be viewed as a vital asset rather than a political liability. The formation of the British Pacific Fleet, or the BPF, was a monumental undertaking that required the coordination of hundreds of ships across 3 different oceans and the establishment of a massive forward base at Sydney, Australia. Churchill followed every development with an obsessive eye for detail, frequently demanding updates on the progress of the fleet train, which was the logistical umbilical cord that would sustain the carriers thousands of miles from the nearest friendly dockyard. The technical challenges of operating high-performance aircraft from the armored decks of British carriers became a central focus of the Admiralty's planning during the mid-war period. The Supermarine Seafire, while a magnificent interceptor in the clear skies of Europe, proved to be a fragile instrument in the harsh environment of a carrier deck, often suffering from collapsed undercarriages during heavy landings. To solve this, the British turned to the American Vought F-4U Corsair, which was a rugged beast of an airplane with a distinctive inverted gull wing that allowed for a massive propeller and incredible speed. However, the Corsair had a notorious reputation for being difficult to land, and the British pilots had to develop a unique curving approach to maintain visibility over the long nose of the aircraft. Churchill personally intervened to ensure that the Royal Navy received the highest priority for Corsair deliveries, because he knew that without a modern fighter wing, the carriers would be nothing more than floating targets for the elite pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy. In early 1944, the Eastern Fleet began to flex its muscles with a series of aggressive raids against Japanese installations in the Dutch East Indies and the Andaman Islands. Operation Crimson was a daring naval bombardment of the port of Sabang, where the British carriers HMS Illustrious and HMS Saratoga operated together in a display of Anglo-American unity. The sight of the ferry Barracuda dive bombers screaming down into Japanese oil tanks signaled the end of the era of British retreat and the beginning of a relentless campaign to dismantle the Japanese war economy. Churchill celebrated these successes in the House of Commons, using them as leverage to secure further concessions from the Americans regarding the post-war administration of liberated territories. He argued that the British contribution to the naval war in the East was proof that the empire was still a first-rate power capable of projecting force at the ends of the earth. The logistical backbone of the British Pacific Fleet was the fleet train, which consisted of over 80 specialized ships, including tankers, ammunition ships, and even a floating brewery to maintain the morale of the sailors. This was the largest and most complex naval logistics operation in British history, and it was built from the ground up under the direct supervision of Churchill's hand-picked experts. The Prime Minister understood that the Americans excelled at this type of industrial-scale warfare, and he pushed the British shipyards to match their pace, even as they were being hammered by German V-weapons. The fleet train allowed the BPF to remain at sea for periods that would have been unthinkable just 2 years earlier, proving that the Royal Navy could adapt to the new realities of transoceanic combat. As 1945 approached, the BPF moved its base of operations to the forward anchorage at Manus in the Admiralty Islands, which was a humid and isolated outpost that the sailors nicknamed Scapa Flow in the Sun. Here, the British carriers integrated with Task Force 58 under the overall command of Admiral Raymond Spruance to participate in the invasion of Okinawa, which was codenamed Operation Iceberg. The British contribution was designated Task Force 57, and its primary mission was to neutralize the Japanese airfields on the Sakishima-Gunto Islands to prevent reinforcements from reaching the main battle. This was a grueling and repetitive task that required the British pilots to fly hundreds of sorties against heavily defended targets, while the carriers themselves remained under the constant threat of a new and terrifying weapon, the kamikaze. The kamikaze, or divine wind, was a desperate tactic born of Japanese failure, but it presented a unique challenge to the Allied fleets that had never been encountered before. On the 4th of May, 1945, a Japanese pilot flying a Zeke fighter slammed into the flight deck of the HMS Formidable, causing a massive explosion that would have sent an American carrier to the bottom. However, the 3-inch steel armor of the British deck held firm, and the ship was back in operation within hours after the sailors simply swept the debris over the side and filled the small crater with quick-drying cement. Churchill's insistence on armored decks was vindicated in the most dramatic fashion possible, and the Americans watched in awe as the British carriers absorbed hits that would have been fatal to their own ships. The Prime Minister received a report on the action and famously remarked that the British carriers were built like floating fortresses that the Japanese could not break. The psychological toll on the sailors of the BPF during the Okinawa campaign was immense as they faced the daily reality of suicide attacks and the oppressive heat of the Pacific summer. Admiral Philip Vian, who commanded the carrier groups, was a relentless leader who demanded perfection from his crews and pushed them to the limits of human endurance. The British sailors lived in cramped and unventilated quarters that were never designed for tropical operations, but they maintained a professional discipline that earned the respect of their American allies. Churchill understood the importance of maintaining British morale, and he ensured that the BPF was regularly mentioned in BBC broadcasts to remind the public that their sons were fighting and winning in the furthest corners of the globe. While the battles raged at sea, Churchill was engaged in a final diplomatic struggle with President Harry Truman and the American leadership at the Potsdam Conference, where the fate of the post-war world was being decided. The Prime Minister used the presence of the BPF at the heart of the Pacific War as his primary bargaining chip to ensure that British interests in Hong Kong and Malaya were protected. He knew that if the British had not been part of the final assault on Japan, the Americans might have been tempted to dictate the terms of the peace without regard for British colonial sovereignty. The BPF was the physical manifestation of Churchill's belief that power at the conference table is directly proportional to the blood spilled on the battlefield. In the final months of the war, the BPF joined the American Third Fleet under Admiral William Bull Halsey for a series of devastating strikes against the Japanese home islands, including the naval base at Yokosuka and the industrial centers of Tokyo. British Corsairs and Avengers flew alongside American Hellcats and Dauntlesses in a display of overwhelming air power that left the Japanese defenses in tatters. The Royal Navy even participated in the final naval bombardment of the Japanese coast, using the massive 14-inch guns of the HMS King George V to level factories and shipping facilities. This was the climax of the journey that began with the miracle at Midway, and it was the fulfillment of Churchill's promise that the British would be there for the finish. The technical superiority of the BPF was further enhanced by the introduction of the Fairey Firefly, which was a 2-seat reconnaissance and strike fighter that proved to be exceptionally effective at low-level attacks against Japanese shipping. The British also led the way in the development of specialized fighter direction techniques, using advanced radar and radio procedures to coordinate the defense of the fleet against incoming air raids. These innovations were shared with the Americans, and contributed to the overall success of the Allied naval campaign, proving that the Royal Navy was still a world leader in naval technology. Churchill took great pride in these achievements, viewing them as a symbol of the enduring genius of the British people. On the 2nd of September, 1945, the formal surrender of the Japanese Empire took place on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, and Winston Churchill ensured that the Royal Navy was represented at the highest level. Admiral Bruce Fraser signed the surrender document on behalf of the United Kingdom, while the massive fleet carriers of the BPF anchored nearby provided a silent but powerful backdrop to the ceremony. This was the moment that Churchill had worked towards since the darkest days of 1942, and it was a bittersweet victory as he had recently been defeated in the general election and was no longer the Prime Minister. However, his legacy was secure, and the presence of the British fleet in Tokyo Bay was a testament to his unwavering belief in the importance of naval power. The aftermath of the war saw the rapid dismantling of the BPF as the British economy struggled under the weight of massive debt and the demands of reconstruction at home. Many of the carriers that had survived the kamikazes were sold for scrap or converted to troop ships to bring the soldiers back from the East. Churchill watched this process with a heavy heart, knowing that the era of British naval supremacy was coming to an end and that the United States was now the undisputed master of the seas. However, he also knew that his demand for a carrier presence had achieved its primary objective by securing the return of British territories and ensuring that the United Kingdom remained a central player in the formation of the New World Order. The story of Churchill's demand for a carrier presence after Midway is a story of strategic foresight and political courage in the face of overwhelming odds. It is a reminder that in the crucible of war, the most important decisions are often those that look beyond the immediate tactical horizon toward the long-term future of the nation. The miracle at Midway gave the Allies a chance, but it was the relentless pressure of men like Winston Churchill that turned that chance into a lasting victory. The armored decks of the British carriers may have been scarred by fire and steel, but they held the line when it mattered most, and they ensured that the white ensign would continue to fly over the oceans of the world for generations to come. As we look back at the monumental events of the Second World War, we must recognize the role of the individual leader in shaping the course of history through sheer force of will. Winston Churchill's obsession with naval logistics and carrier power was not a symptom of an outdated imperial mindset, but a rational response to the changing nature of global conflict. He understood that in a world of airplanes and missiles, the only way to protect a nation's interests is to maintain a credible and offensive force that can reach any target at any time. The legacy of the British Pacific Fleet lives on in the modern Royal Navy, which continues to operate advanced carriers as a symbol of national sovereignty and global reach, just as Churchill intended in 1942. If you were in Churchill's position, would you have risked stripping the defense of the British home waters to send carriers to the Pacific? Or would you have trusted the Americans to handle the Japanese alone? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.